Lisa,
Yes, baby girl.
when I grow up, I want to be a womenace to society.
Then so shall you be.
Hey, this is Lisa Landry. Welcome back to WOMENACE to Society. I'm so excited to speak with today's guest. She's a former Capitol Hill staffer, a Fox News radio political analyst, public speaker, and commentator, and she's also an author. She won first place winner of the 2017 Xulon Press Christian Writers Award. Please welcome Bethany Blankley.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being with me. You're a very busy woman. What is a Capitol Hill staffer? What does that mean?
I was a press secretary, and I worked for 4 senators and 1 congressman on Capitol Hill. The first senator I worked for was Bob Dole when I was still in college, and then I worked for Senator Susan Collins from Maine during the impeachment proceedings of Bill Clinton. That was 24/7, 7 days a week for 1 year of my life.
Oh, gosh.
Devoted to the sexual escapades of Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. So, you know, when people bring up treason and impeachment, it's like they have a very short memory of actual crimes and the political climate of what it was like in D.C. over 20 years ago compared to what I think has just gone downhill in terms of public discourse, lack of reporting by the media, a whole bunch of different things. So I worked for a congressman from New Jersey who's retiring this year, and I was a press secretary. I wrote speeches. I did all of the press releases, spoke with the media, was on TV, and that's kind of how I started getting involved doing my own public speaking later on, having had that background.
That's quite a background. I can only imagine how hard it was going through that impeachment process and having to be a public speaker and representing somebody's words out of an office must have been extremely daunting.
Well, Senator Collins was one of 5 Republicans who's a Republican in name only. She votes with the Democrats the majority of the time. And she was one of 5 at the time who voted not to impeach Clinton. So we were getting 80 press calls a day, and everybody wanted to interview her and talk to her, and I became an expert at saying no comment. And so later on, when I worked for Governor Pataki in New York, and then Diana Taylor, and I was her press secretary. And when I worked for Diana Taylor, everybody wanted to know her business. And so Diana would always say that I was the best no-comment person she had ever met, simply because you're always polite and professional, but at some point you have to either instill humor or sarcasm or something to offset the repeated no, because people don't like being told no.
Oh, gosh.
So, but being retold no 80 times a day, I mean, you have to become creative with how you do that and also diffuse the situation, because there were people who were very hostile and didn't like the fact that I wouldn't give access to someone because I'm doing my job. She doesn't want to talk to them because she hadn't said at the time she was not going to vote to impeach Clinton. And I'm sure there are some issues related to that today in her press office still, because she's not voting with Republicans. So I don't know if she's going to vote for this new Supreme Court nominee or not, but if she doesn't, she could tank his nomination. I don't know if she's going to or not. I don't talk to people there anymore, but knowing her and knowing that press office, I'm sure not much has changed.
It's weird to me how people can present themselves to be something and then vote against what their constituents want. No matter if it's Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever.
Well, that's okay. Yeah, because that's true. I'm sorry to interrupt you. That's true. I mean, it can appear that they're not voting for their constituents, but Maine is a tricky state. The New England states are not necessarily Republican, even though they consider themselves Republican. Mm-hmm. So it's a cultural issue, but then again, senators and congressmen don't vote how their constituents want all the time. Look at John McCain. He doesn't vote the way his constituents want. They've tried to vote him out every election, and he's been winning because of money coming in from PACs from Virginia. It's frustrating, but there are some good people who are still hoping to do something positive. And it may represent the majority, but I could tell you that not everybody is like that.
You know, that leads me to a quote on your website. Too many call evil good and good evil. Dark is called light and light darkness. There does seem to be a lot of saying one thing and doing another.
And also when you are in a discussion with someone and they don't like what you say, or they disagree, then they call you names. Or they say that you're doing the opposite of what you're doing. Or they'll accuse you of something they know themselves are doing. So it's interesting. In Latin, it's called ad hominem, where you attack the person. So you change the subject by putting down the other person. But if you notice a lot in the media, people use Bible quotes all the time. Like Nancy Pelosi was saying something about how Jesus was a refugee. Baby Moses was a refugee. Maxine Waters said God told her to do this. So a lot of people will use these, like we call it proof texting, where they will take a verse or use something, and they don't just do it with the Bible, they do it with other things, but they will say something to make it mean something that it doesn't. And that's kind of why most of my writing or speaking always goes to a context, because people can make something mean anything they want it to say.
Yeah, it's all about perception and messaging. Which leads me to the reason I contacted you, actually. I am blown away by the series you're writing on God's Zodiac, the Gospel in the Stars. And to quote you again, what if everything you were ever taught or believed about astronomy, horoscopes, and the zodiac were false? What if the original zodiac was perverted, distorted, and changed to such an extent that no one knew its original meaning imprinted in the sky? So have we done this with the zodiac too? We've kind of taken things and twisted them around, and now we have a method that doesn't mean anything?
I would say yes, partially because we don't learn the classics anymore. And we've lost a sense of history that is connected to centuries of studies from other worlds and cultures. And I actually bring this up, and it's a big emphasis in my book, which is out now by Zealon Press. It's called What Every Christian Needs to Know About Islam. And the book isn't just about Islam, because it talks about the rich history of Christianity in pre-Islamic Arabia. And the image in the cover of my book is from a book that was published in 1000 AD. And it was by a scientist and astronomer who did a chronology of the civilizations. Can you imagine? So he's doing a chronology of ancient civilizations in 1000 AD.
Okay.
So he's going through and giving you a history of all of the histories of the centuries of years of study of all of these ancient nations up to 1000 AD. And so in it, he goes through Bible stories, and he goes through astronomy and what people believed in the stars. And so when you actually study astronomy, a lot of these stars' names have Arabic names. They have Hebrew names. They have Aramaic names. They have Babylonian names, because people were studying these signs. I mean, all ancient cultures, the sense of order in their lives had to relate to the seasons, the sun and the moon, because it ordered the crops. So if your life is consistently based on how do you do self-preservation, how do you survive, well, it's based on crops. When do animals have their babies? In the spring. When is there an equinox? When is there a longer season? When is there a less season? And so everything had to do with the position of the moon and the stars. And so I stumbled across this book written in the 1800s from lectures given by this man called Joseph Augustus Cease. And I cite it throughout the series. And he gave a series of lectures where he goes through the vastness of the universe, and he ties it to the creation story. And then he also ties it to, there are different Genesis accounts. So the Chaldeans had a Genesis account, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, they all had their version. And so that metamorphosized into what we know as the Greek and Roman stories of Zeus and Venus and mythology. So we think of like Greek mythology or Roman mythology as ancient, but that was actually a revision of pre-existing mythology. And those are Romanized and Greek names of pre-existing stories.
So they just rebranded? I want to figure this out. They just they took the same thing and then they just gave different names to the characters? Kind of, sort of?
Well,
ish?
Yes, because they have different languages. For example, the name for Artemis Athena. It's the same as Ishtar and Isis and other names for the same goddesses or previous cultures. So I talk about the crescent moon and the three goddesses in my book. But these goddesses, for example, Venus was the Roman name. Greek, it was Aphrodite. Hebrew, it was Ashtoreth. But in Egyptian, it was Isis. In Babylon, it was Ishtar. So you have the same star and the same sky in every culture or language. According to Christians, all of this comes after the biblical story. So we rename things that make sense to us in our culture or maybe through cultural context. And remember, back then, they had these huge monuments and temples that were bigger than cities, bigger than, like a small temple would be bigger than one of our biggest malls in America. They had like these things that they went to on pilgrims where they would go and they had sacrifices to these gods. And they became citizens of cities that had these huge statues to each of those gods. So this all ties into the name of Allah, which comes from Alat, which is a transliteration from a female name of the goddess. But the point is that when you look at the writings from the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Chaldeans, it's all tied into a revision of the pre-existing story of what God imprinted in the sky. So when you see these hero stories, Jason fighting the lion, or Leviathan, which is in the Old Testament, or the big snake, or the dragon, those are all there. They're in the sky. And so the purpose of the gospel is to say that all of these things point to Jesus. Well, who is the wounded person in his heel? It's Jesus. Because in Isaiah, it talks about this. In the Psalms, it talks about this. So if God, the creator of the universe, in Psalms 147, it says, he determines the number of stars and calls them each by name. And in Isaiah, lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created them? He who brings out the starry hosts one by one and calls them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. So if we believe that God created the universe and he created and named each of the stars, then wouldn't we think that there's a story behind them? And so that's what I love about this book, is that Cease tells the story and ties it into biblical prophecy. But he also uses the history from like the Persian scholars and from the Hebrew and the Aramaic and the Arabic. And so almost every star has an Arabic word to it in addition to Hebrew, because all of these astronomers were looking at the same stars. I mean, think about it. The three magi, they came from what is present-day Iran, through Yemen, and up through a trade route up into Bethlehem. So the people who were studying the stars were all over. It wasn't just in Israel or present-day Iran. It was in India and in China. There's a whole Chinese horoscope that's slightly different. And so it's just fascinating because everybody has their own version of a story, but where does the original come from? And that's kind of where I got into this whole thing was, well, if this isn't true, then what is the truth and where does that come from? And so that's kind of the joy of reading Cease's book.
How did you ever find that book? Because it seems like that would be a very difficult book to hunt down.
A friend of mine who's old school told me about it. So I did a Google search, and somehow I think actually that it is possible for someone to get a copy of a print of his talks in a book. And I think if they were to Google it, it's called The Gospel in the Stars by Joseph Augustus Cease. In my book, it says, frequently asked questions, go to www.general-books.net/facts, FAQS.CFM ? You're also welcome to contact LLC in Memphis. My book version was printed in 2012. It's possible that they could get this version online, but there's also a newer version that is produced by Ken Fleming called God's Voice in the Stars. And he kind of revised something that Cease had done, and he made it more modern. I prefer the Cease version because it's the original, as opposed to someone else who's kind of paraphrasing what somebody else said.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I'd want to go to the source.
And then there was also somebody who wrote a book that was pretty famous, and her name was Bertha Harris, and she wrote something called Hieroglyphics of the Heavens. And so she also wrote about the history and the meanings behind these stories. Yeah, I mean, ancient Syriac, the Babylonian language was Akkadian. So these were all written down, by the way, in stones that were found that date back to 3,000 years ago. There's incredible history of people who've been studying this for thousands of years. And unfortunately, our schools don't teach this, but there's such beauty to it, especially for Christians, to realize that if God named all of the stars, then there have to be stories behind them. And maybe there's something other than the Big Dipper and the Small Dipper. Maybe those are something else.
I'm sure there's a lot of stuff we overlook, as humans.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're made of stardust. We have the same elements as stars, so obviously we do have some sort of physical connection.
Well, it's just, it's really neat because I love reading. I always have loved writing and telling stories. So to unpack the stories that other people tell or where the stories come from, it was just like a whole new world opened up. So this is something fun that I've done on the side since I write about politics, and this really isn't about that. And then, not everybody likes this. By the way, there are people who say there's no basis for this. This is a bunch of poppycock. There's no biblical basis for this. I say, well, why not investigate? Why not find out for yourself?
Yeah, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Tell me, I don't know if you can distill this into just a few sentences, but if we're all looking at these stars, we have named many of these stars, but they all have different names according to different cultures. How do we get so far off where we have all these major religions at each other's throats?
Basically, it depends on who's writing history and where you have access to information.
Mm-hmm.
So the good news is that through the internet, you do have access to information. For example, the book that I cite in my book that's from 1000 AD,
Mm-hmm.
you can read it online for free in an English translation. You can actually download it and read it. So the internet has given us a miraculous tool to access information that we wouldn't have been able to do before. And I think, with migration, displacement of people, the cultures and wars, destruction of libraries, how people pass on information, the emphasis of what should be taught and what isn't taught, I think it depends. There are a lot of factors as to why we don't know the history. And so one of the things I've written about, especially with a lot of people, relating to Islam or Muslims or even Iran or Iraq or political issues, is that there are a lot of Christians in these regions, and they haven't been there for thousands of years. And when we talk about killing people, we're talking about killing a culture and history. So in Iraq, there are artifacts that were there during biblical times. There are just incredible artifacts. I mean, one of the places I would love to go is Persepolis, and that's in Iran. Noah's Ark is supposedly in eastern Turkey. There are all kinds of things throughout Turkey and Greece and in Israel. But because of political issues, they're not excavating.
That's a travesty. So, it's awful. That's awful.
The thing with knowledge is it's a catch-22. The more you learn, the more you realize, the less you know. And I think that was the interesting aspect for my book, was it's just a survey of the history of this region and how people came to believe what they believed. There's so much more depth. Not everybody readers encyclopedia. So
right.
For me, it was trying to fit all this into like what ended up being 350 pages. And I think understanding our roots and where our faith and our culture or perceptions or even understanding of the world, understanding where that comes from, I think is important to how we can interact with other people and understand our place in this world. And so to me, that was kind of one goal behind the book, but also in my writing in general.
Your writing is beautiful because it's very great information, and you don't make it too heady, even though it is kind of hard because you're distilling a bunch of information that we haven't thought of these things in this manner, probably, as we read it, and it's still easy to access.
What is your sign?
I'm a Leo.
Oh, okay. So Leo, I haven't written that yet, but Leo is the end of the story, and Leo is the victor. Yeah, I haven't done him yet, but Leo is the victor. There are two major stars, Ursa Major and then the other one is Leo, of course. But if you think about the Sphinx in Egypt,
Right.
with the head of a woman and a tail of a lion, that goes back to Leo. So anyway, you have Leo, which is the lion, and then Hydra, which is the snake underneath. And Hydra, if anybody is a Marvel's Avengers fans, you'll know that Hydra is a really evil entity that Captain Marvel and all the others try to fight against. When you're looking at the sky, there's the ecliptic line goes straight underneath the lion and the Hydra snake. So it shows that Leo obviously triumphs and kills the snake. And it's the ending point of the prophecy of the Lion of Judah, which is the tribe of Judah. It goes to the final story where, Jesus conquers Satan and the end battle. And for any Narnia fans, it goes to the last battle in that series where Aslan the lion defeats the enemy. And so at the end of the day, good triumphs over evil. And so Leo is victorious for treading underfoot. It means there's ultimately justice. So all of the wrong that goes on in the world, at the end of the day, we know that the wrongs will be righted. Hydra is always a symbol of evil, and it always ends because the lion will always win. And you have a strong sign of the final story within this series ends with Leo, who's the triumphant victor.
That's a good ending. I think you're remarkable. I'm so very delighted that you would give me this time and share your thoughts with my listeners. Bethany Blankley, check her out, BethanyBlankley.com. And your new book, What Every Christian Needs to Know About Islam, is out now, yeah?
Yep, you can order it on Zulan's website, and I am going to have a link to that on my website, which I'm hoping to put up today.
Excellent.
And it will also be on Pathos and some other places where my articles are.
Yes, your articles are on Pathos. Please do check them out if you're listening. Very interesting stuff. Lots of food for thought. Lots of deep, really cool stuff. Again, just thank you very much, Bethany.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's nice to hear a different perspective, and I greatly respect Bethany's intellect. I think it's super cool that she's seeing things from a different angle. Please do check her out. She's a dynamic writer, BethanyBlankley.com. And also come to my.com, LisaLandry.com. If you subscribe to my YouTube channel, you will know when each new podcast drops every Women's Wednesday. Shout out to my Ari Bear. I wish we were stargazing in the desert in Arizona.